Do you want me to look into the camera?
Okay. This is an interview with Werner Michel for the Virginia Holocaust Museum, Richmond, Virginia. Today is October 16th, 2006. We are in the Virginia Holocaust Museum. The interview is conducted by Inga Horowitz. Videographer is Chuck Weitzenhofer. Mr. Michel, could you please state your name and place of birth and then spell them, please?
My name is Werner Michel. I was born on September the 2nd, 1924 in Landau, Germany. I'll spell my name as Werner Michel.
Thank you. Who were the members of your immediate family?
The members of my immediate family were my father, whose name was Ludwig, Ludwig Michel. My mother, whose name was Paula, Paula, born with the name of Henle, Henle, Michel, and my sister, whose name was Ruth Michel.
And what languages do you speak?
I speak English and German.
Okay. We'll talk about 1933, when Hitler came to power, when the Holocaust began. Where were you living before 1933?
I lived in Landau from the time of my birth until I left for the United States in November, December 1936.
And how long had your family lived in Germany, in Landau, or in Germany?
My ancestors, as far as I can recall, on my father's side, came from a small town just north of Landau. It was a village, actually, called Edesheim, Edesheim, which is located along the Weinstraße, the wine road, which is very well known as being where the viniculture takes place. On my mother's side, my grandfather was born in Ichenhausen, Ichenhausen, which is located near the large town of Ulm, ULM, and they lived in Bavaria.
Is all of this in Bavaria, or that was only your mother's home?
Actually, I was born in the Palatinate, in German, Pfalz, Pfalz, which was a part of Bavaria at that time, even though it was not physically connected to Bavaria at the time, but it belonged to Bavaria and had belonged to Bavaria for well over 100 years.
So, and this was Landau on the map we saw was near the French border.
It is
southern Germany.
Very close to the French border. I would say about uh, 20 miles from the French border, north of the French border. But west of the Rhine, it's basically in the foothills of the leading towards the Vosges mountains.
Mm-hmm. And vineyard country.
Yes.
What was your father's profession?
My father's business was to deal. He would buy up the grape harvest from the farmers growing grapes, and then he would obtain a commission when he sold that harvest to a larger vintner.
Mm-hmm. So he was like a broker.
Yes.
I assume your life changed with the rise of Nazi power and Hitler coming to. What was your life and what was the family life like before 1933? The housing, the entertainment your parents had, education, their lifestyle, just in general.
Well, we were basically middle class German citizens. My grandfather had served in the Bavarian army. My father served in a Bavarian infantry regiment in World War I. And we belonged to the local Jewish community in Landau, which had all kinds of religious and social activities, of course. Mm-hmm. I personally had a lot of non-Jewish friends, as boys would tend to have, and we played the normal games that boys do. And I started school, I suppose it was in 1930.
You were 6.
And what is known as the elementary school or Volksschule, mm-hmm. And attended that through grade 4. Mm-hmm. When we were transferred to the Realschule, and the Realschule had a more commercial curriculum than the others. Than the other schools. There was the other school where a lot of young people attended, were to prepare them to go into a trade. Mm-hmm. Or if they were girls, they went often to the gymnasium, which had sort of a humanistic curriculum. My sister went to the gymnasium. I went to the Realschule.
We didn't find out. Your sister was older or younger? When was she born?
My sister was born in 1920 and was 4.5 years older than I was.
Mm-hmm. So were the Realschule and the Gymnasium parallel, or did one follow the other?
They were parallel. One was to prepare you for a commercial profession. The gymnasium was, as I said, followed a liberal arts curriculum, which included Latin and Greek. It was sort of a classical curriculum.
And what were you preparing? So you went through grade 4 in the Volksschule, that was 1934, and then into the
Yes.
Realschule. You were then 10 years old.
When I
Into the, what were you preparing for or thinking of becoming?
well, whatever I was preparing for didn't last very long because we were ejected from the Realschule in early 1935. All Jewish students were eliminated from German society, and we attended then a one-room special educational class which was operated by the Jewish community in Landau.
And all children of all ages were in this room?
Yes.
How many students?
You
remember?
That's difficult for me to estimate. I would say between 40 and 50.
Oh, really? And how...
I could be wrong.
Yeah, but you remember it as that many?
Yeah.
It was all ages?
Yes.
With one teacher?
There was just one teacher, yeah. My evaluation from that teacher is included in my documents.
Really?
Yes.
Well, we will scan that later. So what experiences, other than being ejected from school, with anti-Semitism did you have? Describe how your life changed from what sounds like a rather idyllic life before all of this. Maybe I'm...
Well, we led a relatively normal life before, and we were assimilated into German society. The Jewish community in Landau was quite substantial. It probably had between 400 and 500 members, and they had quite a magnificent synagogue, which was burned down during the Kristallnacht, which was after my time, of course. And initially, when the Nazis came to power, my relatives, and particularly my father, said that they did not believe that anti-Semitism would be that strong, even though there was, of course, a collective, I would say, collective memory that there had been anti-Semitism below the surface, which made it somewhat difficult for Jews to get into certain professions.
Prior to all of this, there was this history.
Yes.
And then?
And then in my first personal experience in 1933 of active anti-Semitic measures was when my grandfather's antique shop was the subject of a boycott when Nazi stormtroopers stood in front of the shop And while they did not actively prohibit customers from entering his shop, they would insist on writing down the identity and the purpose of that person's reason for entering the shop. Mm. As you can well imagine, this was not conducive to continuing his business, even though he'd been there for many, many, many years. Mm-hmm. And I also noticed that all my friends, particularly my non-Jewish friends, had joined the Jungvolk, which was one of the Nazi youth organizations. And at first, they came to my house and still visited me, even though they wore their uniforms. But then their parents obviously persuaded them not to have any contact with me any longer. And so gradually our relationships died out. And we became more and more dependent on just being amongst my Jewish compatriots.
Were you active in sports with these boys, or how?
Well, we
what
played.
Kind of friends were they?
We played games together. Mm-hmm. We played many games together. And I remember, for instance, one little anecdote where 3 of the non-Jewish boys living in the same block as I did, we built a small raft together. Mm-hmm. And put it in the local river. There's a small river that flows through the town. Mm-hmm. And we got on this raft with the intentions of floating down this river, and unfortunately it broke up within about 100 feet.
Uh-huh. So you were...
It's sort of indelible in my memory for some reason.
Well, were there your father's work, was he able to continue his work? Your grandfather had to close his shop, I presume.
No, my grandfather did not close his shop. Mm-hmm. He continued as long as he lived. He died the next year in 1935. Mm-hmm. But my father found it progressively more difficult to make a living for our family, mm-hmm. which I'm certain contributed to the early decision of my parents to send my sister to the United States when the opportunity arose.
When was that, and what happened with your sister?
That was in early 1934. Mm-hmm. And after dealing with the bureaucratic requirements, she was able to go on one of the early, we don't call it Kindertransport, of the 1,000 children mm-hmm. group, one of the early groups. Mm-hmm. And she came to the United States, I believe, in November 1934, one of the very early groups.
Mm-hmm. So she was 14 years old.
She was 14. She was almost 15 when she arrived. Mm-hmm. She was taken in by a family in St. Louis.
A Jewish family?
Yes.
In St. Louis. And, well, let's get to your immigration. Do you remember restrictions other than what you've already talked about? Do you remember restrictions that were placed on Jews? You
Well,
couldn't attend school, your grandfather's store was boycotted, your father what happened to him? That he couldn't continue to...
Well, of course, my father, as I probably mentioned to you earlier, he died in Auschwitz.
Later.
This was when I left Germany in 1936, in late 1936. He concurrently fled to France, and he lived in France for several years, but was unable to get a work permit. It was very difficult. There was anti-Semitism in France as well. And so somehow he got to Belgium, and in 1941 actually, he was arrested by the Germans. He was brought back to Germany. He was tried before a court, ostensibly on criminal allegations. He was sentenced to 2.5 or 3 years of hard labor, and was sent to work camps in northern Germany, where the labor involved, I might say that the allegations were that he had taken the grape harvest from several of these grape growers and had not paid them the full amount that they should have received. From reading the documentation, my impression and the impression of some German friends who helped me do this research was that this was a trumped-up charge. But in the meantime, he was in this labor camp where they worked in the moors of in northern Germany, just a few miles east of the Dutch border. And he was in several of these camps until he was declared unfit to work in these, in digging up peat.
Peat bogs.
Peat bogs, exactly. And he was turned over to the, what the Germans call the executive authorities, who then sent him to Auschwitz. And that's my father's story. My mother was left behind after I left Germany. Of course, you asked me about other experiences,
Yes.
and I'll briefly return to that.
Okay.
In 1934, when I was still in the German school, we already we were taken out, while I was in school, we were taken out to observe the book burning, of when they were burning all the books by what the Germans call degenerate authors and leftists and communists and Jews. And we were taken out, we were marched out from our class to observe this burning of these books.
Can you describe what you remember of
What's
that?
that?
What do you remember? What was the scene like?
Well, I in some ways I was too young to really comprehend what all this meant, because of course, being average Germans, we thought that no, we weren't for communism anyway. Mm-hmm. We had, I might just digress for a moment, point out that the Rhineland, and particularly the Palatinate, was occupied by French forces long after World War I ended. Mm. And my town became sort of a military headquarters for the French forces in the area. And I remember that we all hated the French, which was a residue of not only World War I, but I think it had existed there for many, many years, because in the early 18th century, the French had come into the Palatinate and had burned down, or this is in the not the 18th century, but in the 17th century. And they had burned down many of the towns, including the Landau, and then they had rebuilt. This was under Louis XIV, so the history goes back quite a ways.
Was deep feeling.
Yes.
So the book burning was something that you probably didn't know how to
I saw nothing
evaluate.
wrong with it. Mm-hmm. I said if it was done by bad people, then perhaps.
Did you realize that Jewish books too, or prayer books, were being burned, or?
No, I wasn't aware of that. Mm-hmm. I didn't see any of that sort of thing going on.
Was there any resistance or sabotage in your city against the Nazis?
I remember prior to 1933, standing on the balcony of our home and looking out, and there were street fights between the opposing parties, between the right-wing Nazis and certain communist groups. Mm-hmm. They became very violent, and I observed that. But my father always was very moderate in his political beliefs, and he just wanted the best thing for Germany.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that he felt the Nazis had what was best for Germany? Was he?
No. The only thing I recall is that they thought this coming of the Nazis was a very transient phase as a result of the probably of the Depression, and that this would blow over in a short time. That these things had happened in history before, and that the Jews had often been the scapegoats when something went wrong in German society.
It was not that new.
No.
When you left in, you said November, December, you left Germany.
Yes.
When exactly did you leave?
I left on November the 26th, 1936.
And when did your father leave?
My father left about a week or 2 weeks before I did.
Oh, also in November.
Yeah.
What did your mother do then? Before we get to your going
My
away?
mother remained in Landau, and until 1937, and then she left to Offenbach am Main, which is very near Frankfurt, and worked for a family there, a Jewish family, until her visa was approved. And she came to the United States then before Kristallnacht in 1938. And she and my sister and I were reunited in St. Louis.
How fortunate.
But my father never.
No.
We were never able to get a visa for him because the waiting period
It was so long.
was impossible.
Did he think going to France that he would be able to bring the family with? No, you were already on your way, but
Yes.
his wife,
No, he,
if things worked out?
as a matter of fact, he made no attempt to have her come to France at all. His focus was to join us in America, and in the letters that I still have, they're very heart-rending letters. He hoped that we would be able to obtain a visa for him. My sister and mother worked on that. I guess I was 14, and I was not involved in that. I probably should have been.
Well, some of those letters would be of interest too if you have them. So the circumstances of your ability to leave Germany, how was that arranged at that time?
Well, at first, as I recall, there was correspondence between Jewish organizations which were helping the emigration of Jews from out of Germany to the United States.
Your family writing to Jewish organizations.
Yes. And I recall there is one letter, I think it's enclosed somewhere in my dossier, that there was no longer a possibility for me to go to the United States. This was in 1935. But then in early 1936, they, after other I won't say appeals, but other requests from my father, they wrote back and said, yes, we have found a place for your son. And they sent a form, and my father had to sign it, that he agreed to my Ausreise, to my emigration.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, my mother, I recall, put me on a train for Stuttgart, where I had to be interviewed by the American consulate.
Mm-hmm.
And that took place, I believe, in October 1936.
Mm-hmm. And then you were interviewed and approved?
Apparently they approved
visa.
it.
And then you went back home.
And I went back to Landau. And then in early November, they got a letter came urgently suggesting that we say our farewells as in the home city rather than coming to Hamburg. They said this would arouse too much attention and would make it very difficult. The arrangements would be very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And they also had some other instructions which are not germane, such as don't bring bicycles and don't bring heavy cases of books, because the children will be learning English, and so large containers full of books would be of no assistance.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that sort of advice that they gave, and they said they advised strongly to say farewell in your home city. But my mother did accompany me on the train to Mannheim, and she placed me aboard the train to Hamburg, which was an express train.
Mm-hmm. So you said goodbye to her.
And that's when we said goodbye.
Mannheim. Do you remember how you felt?
Well,
you were then how old? 20?
I was on my way to 13. I was over 12.
Mm-hmm. You had had your 13th birthday.
No, I hadn't.
September. Oh.
No, I hadn't.
No, you hadn't.
It was
you
November.
You were 12 in September, and this was November.
Yeah, in September was my 12th birthday,
yes.
So it was about 3 months after that.
Mm-hmm.
And my feelings were very ambivalent, because one, of course, doesn't like to leave your home, and I didn't want to leave my mother behind, or my grandmother, who remained there. My grandmother was very elderly at that time, and shortly thereafter, they placed my mother and my aunt, her sister, placed my grandmother in a Jewish old folks' home in a nearby town where there was a somewhat larger Jewish population. My grandmother at that time was probably 84 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And she was in 1940, she was taken to this camp, de Gurs, as I told you
Oh, really?
yesterday,
Yes,
I
you
believe,
did. Right.
where she died soon thereafter of the dreadful conditions in that
Of course.
camp.
At Gurs in France.
Yes, it was the Pyrenees, the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains,
Yes.
near the Spanish border.
So you left behind your mother and your grandmother at
Yes.
the time and went by train eventually alone to Hamburg.
To Hamburg, yeah.
And carrying what with you?
I didn't have very much. I remember I had a small box camera, which you can see in that picture, I believe. And I had a small suitcase. I may have had a larger suitcase, but I don't remember that. I just had a small one.
Why don't we look at these pictures now before you go on your voyage to America? This upper picture, you're with your parents.
Yes.
Do you remember that? You look about 11 or so there.
Yes, that was taken in our home. Oh, not in our home, it was taken in Landau.
In a
That's
studio.
of my father, mother, and myself. This is obviously after my sister had left.
Yes. And this
is
a picture of
my
your
father in looking very proud in his German or Bavarian uniform,
and here.
probably prior to probably during World War I. And this is during World War I. He was, this was taken, I believe he was in Belgium at that time.
And then here you are, this little boy in black.
Yeah, I'm here. I think I'm carrying my little suitcase and the box camera.
And this was it? You had no other luggage?
There might have been more luggage, but I certainly didn't carry it with me.
And these other are children?
These were other
adults, or older people.
I thought that I was accompanied by more children, but I learned through Iris Posner of the 1,000 Children, who has done all this magnificent research, that there were only 9 of us
on this ship.
On the New York, which was a German ship. And we had a miserable crossing.
Oh.
Because the weather was so bad.
Here you are on board the ship.
This is on board the ship. It was taken by a German sailor. It's merchant sailor.
And how did you get the picture?
He took it. I gave him my camera and asked him if he would.
Oh, with your camera.
Yeah.
I see.
Yep.
I see. And explain what this is. Side and this is the back of this
This
document.
is the front of the Kinderreisepass, which is the equivalent of a visa, I would say, for someone below the age of 18 or whatever the age was. Since I wasn't an adult, this was given to me, and this is the back. Of course, has the significant certificate from the American consul in Stuttgart imprinted on it.
Yes, and at the top is Bürgermeister from the Stadt Landau.
Yes.
And the date here is 11th of July, 1936.
So this I got, and I had to take that later with me to Stuttgart.
Right.
So this was predated by a couple of months, I would say. My trip to Stuttgart, to the American consulate. I'm quite certain my trip there was in late September or early October.
And there were 9 children
Yes.
in this group of
Yes.
Jewish children going to America.
I'm going to America, yes.
And this group was eventually called part of this larger, called 1,000 Children.
Yes.
And explain, why have we heard so little about these 1,000 children coming to America?
I can only speculate. Because I've heard of the Kindertransport, which went to England,
Yes,
which was several thousand children.
yes.
However, I understand that domestic considerations in this country made it inappropriate, or not appropriate, let's say, to have a similar program here, even though that members of the Jewish community here attempted to bring more refugees from Germany to the United States. However, characteristically, I think there was a hesitancy on the part of the senior political leadership to exacerbate unemployment here.
I see.
And I think there was a reluctance then to permit too many immigrants to come. Even though, as I recall now, special exceptions were made for well-known artists like Marc Chagall and those and well-known personages in the arts and in the sciences.
Yes.
But
For
for the average, ordinary children, there was no program like the one to England. And so the Iris Posner came up with the idea of, instead of duplicating the term Kindertransport, they quite properly chose to call it the 1,000 children, because that's apparently the total that came over were approximately 1,000. There might have been a few more, there might have been a few less.
What was the age range? Do you have any idea? Were they all teenagers like you, more or less, 12?
I think most of us were teenagers, or even, there were some that were even younger.
Mm-hmm. Were there chaperones? Did you on the ship?
Not on the ship, no. As far as I recall, the chaperone that you see in the picture up here just delivered us to the ship from there was a Jewish welfare facility in Hamburg where we stayed overnight, one night. And similarly, I believe in New York, they had a facility which was operated by, I think, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, or the Joint Distribution Committee. I'm not sure which one. And I remember that by that time they had found a family to take me in as a foster child. And they put me on an overnight train and pinned my name on the lapel of my coat so that I could be readily identified, because I didn't speak any English.
So you were met in New York by Hyas, or one of
the
agents.
yes. And I only spent, if I'm not even sure, I think I spent one night in New York.
Mm-hmm. And then by train.
They were very anxious to get us to our destinations, as I recall.
What were you feeling and thinking then? Do you remember?
Well, I, of course, was elated to be out of Germany.
You remember feeling that?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I had somewhat a longing for my homeland. You know, it was not. It's very difficult, of course, to explain that. But
do you remember crying at all?
After I got to St. Louis and lived with his family, there were times when I would have preferred to go back to Germany.
It was not a happy place?
Yes, it was a wonderful family.
Uh-huh.
But they had a son who was essentially my age. And he sometimes seemed to resent having to look after me, because the wife, the mother of the family, insisted that he help me acclimate myself to society here in the United States. And he sometimes was very resentful of that.
Mm-hmm. Was he an only child?
Oh, it appeared that way.
Yeah. He was an only child?
No.
No.
There were two sons, and then they had a foster daughter also living there.
Also from Germany?
No.
From Europe?
No, she was an American girl.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to give the name of the family?
Yes, their name was Milton Landau, was the name of the family.
The same name as your town, hometown.
Yes. Yes.
And then you were...
as I was saying, their son, whose name was William, who became had an excellent reputation later on as a neurologist. But at the time I remember he was supposed to teach me how to use a streetcar. Mm-hmm. I didn't know how to do that. And he put me aboard the streetcar, and then he got off at a stop and just left me on that streetcar. And he was supposed to have me play with the neighborhood boys, most of whom were not Jewish. And by the way, the family themselves were not actively
observant.
They did not participate. They wanted to know if I wanted to attend synagogue, and I said yes, I did. But I attended a very reform congregation in St. Louis. It was called Temple Israel. Mm-hmm. And it was so reform that they didn't even refer to the bar mitzvah as bar mitzvah. They referred to it as confirmation. And you saw that document. I have that
at
with
age
me.
13?
Yes.
And so you were...
I was confirmed.
Confirmed at age 13. And you were living with them then?
I was living with them then, yes.
Mm-hmm. What had your religious life been like? We didn't, just quickly, in Germany. Were your parents very observant?
Well, we attended services. We were not Orthodox. I think we were more like conservative. And of course I studied Hebrew as a boy, very reluctantly. It was very hard for me. And then when I came to the United States, of course, I lived with this family who were not at all, they didn't participate, they didn't belong to a congregation at all, even though they were the most charitable and giving and liberal people you can imagine. Otherwise, they wouldn't have taken this flotsam and jetsam in from Germany.
And another foster child as well.
And as I said, the son was not very helpful.
Describe your school situation. You didn't speak English.
Well, it was thought the best thing that could be done was to put me into a school as soon as possible. And being almost 13, or on the way to 13, they thought that 7th grade might be appropriate because you graduated at 14. That would give me a year and a half. But I wasn't able to communicate at all. I think I mentioned that to you in our earlier conversation. And since I spoke no more than 10 or 20 words of English, they gave me an aptitude test which didn't really help me. All it did is convince them that I would never make it in 7th grade, and they put me then into 1st grade, which was, in retrospect, was probably a wonderful thing because they were ahead of their time because it was immersion, language immersion, which is, I think, the best way.
And the children were learning to read.
Yes. Children were just learning. They were sitting around small round tables, and I sat there in a big chair, and they were sitting in little chairs. And so I was in 1st grade for a few weeks, and then they put me into 2nd grade and 3rd grade, and until I finally caught up with my contemporaries. And I graduated from Eugene Field Elementary School in St. Louis. I think it was 1939. In the meantime, my mother arrived, and we had our own apartment, but very little.
1939, you were 15 years old when you graduated from elementary school.
Yes.
Go ahead, your mother arrived.
My mother arrived in 1938. Or did I graduate in 38? No, I think I graduated in 39 when I was 15. And our financial situation was rather precarious.
How was her English?
What then?
Did she have English? Could she speak English?
Spoke no English.
No English.
No. She had learned French when she was a girl, as most everyone did in the Palatinate, because it was so close to France.
Right.
and had been part of France for so many years.
So how did she make a living?
Well, we rented a rather large apartment, and my sister was just graduating from high school, by the way. Mm-hmm. I was 15, she was 19, I guess. Mm-hmm. And we rented out rooms to other refugees. Mm-hmm. And I had a newspaper. I delivered newspapers and sold magazines and worked in a drive-in theater.
And your mother?
My mother was just at home. Yeah, she was just at home.
At home. And so you brought in the money from...
I brought in a little. My sister then managed to get she was very bright, and she managed to get a scholarship. But because of our financial situation, she couldn't accept it, or didn't accept it, and she went to work in a department store in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And became a sales clerk. Mm-hmm. And I started high school, and as I said, I delivered newspapers, sold magazines, and so forth. And then my sister met a man who was doing very well in the textile business, and he subsequently was very, very successful. And she married him, and he provided very well for her. And I was in high school, and during vacation, I would go to work for my brother-in-law, and he had a wholesale textile business. And during vacation, I would carry his sample cases. He went out also mm-hmm. as a salesman, in addition to running the business. Mm-hmm. And I would load and unload the car with the cases, and so I would assist him. And finally, after I was in high school 2 to 2.5 years, I think I was 2.5 years in high school, he suggested that high school was really a waste of time for me.
Really?
And he said, you will do a lot better if you come to work in my business, because you'll have a great future. Mm-hmm. And so my mother, we didn't have much of a flexibility, and so I left high school after 2.5 years.
Really?
And became a shipping clerk in his business. And I made very minimum income. I think my pay was something like $12 a week. Mm. And I worked very hard. And because it was hard work. I would load and unload packages and pack packages, get them ready for shipping to the various customers. And finally, this is now, the war had started, and as I said, I think I left high school in 1942, a year after the war started.
Mm-hmm. So then you started, we want to get to this next career. How long were you working as a shipping clerk then?
Let me back up for one moment. Concurrently with the war starting, we were declared as enemy aliens.
Mm-hmm. That was December 41?
That was in December 41. I was still in high school at that time. I don't think I went to work for him until 1942. So you may find that my memory is somewhat...
That's okay.
It may not be as good as I'd like.
December 41 was when the war was declared.
The war was
you
declared.
Said.
And I remember I wanted to volunteer and do something because we had lost contact with our father.
Mm-hmm.
And we had found out that our grandmother had died in the camp. We didn't know exactly. We had no detailed information.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to volunteer, but as an enemy alien, I couldn't volunteer. I went to work. I went to join a reserve element, which was called the State Guard, the Missouri State Guard. And we really, I'm sure, contributed nothing to the defense of this country. We just met and did drilling and went out in the woods a little bit, but we didn't do anything. And in the meantime, I worked for my brother-in-law, and I recall I asked for a raise once, and I think he gave me a 2-cent raise. And I went up from 30 cents an hour to 32.5 cents an hour, something like that. And then he let me work overtime, and that he had to pay time and a half.
Extra. Mm-hmm.
But he was...
How long did you put up with that?
Well, what happened then was in 1943, while I was still working, I found out that in early 43 that while they might not draft me, I could volunteer enlistment as a draftee, equivalent to a draftee. This would probably free up somebody else, but I came into the Army as a private in July the 22nd, 1943. And I was deliriously happy to be away from my brother-in-law's business, which was a disaster for me personally.
It sounds that way. And where, would you tell us briefly, I know that was the beginning of a very long military career.
Yes.
Just tell us briefly where that military career took you in the beginning. I know that was highly interesting and pertaining to the Holocaust.
Well, I was, initially I was sent to basic training at Fort Knox, and I won't go into that. I'll just say that from there I was sent to an armored division at Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, and evidently my commanders must have thought that I was officer material, and I was appointed to go to the infantry officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia. And I took that course. It was very tough and very demanding, physically, particularly. And I was commissioned on December the 29th, 1944. The war was still on.
As a lieutenant?
As a second lieutenant, yes.
And then?
Then I went, I had another brief assignment, and from there I was sent to someone must have discovered I spoke German, and they needed German linguists very badly. And I was sent to the Military Intelligence Training Center, at that time located at Camp Ritchie, Maryland, to take the interrogation officers course, German interrogation officers course. In the meantime, when this course ended, the war ended. And I was, with the rest of my class, we were sent to England, then to France, and then to Germany, where I was placed. I was a second lieutenant. I was placed in charge of a interrogation detachment. I interrogated prisoners of war, and of course what we were trying to do was identify among the prisoners any SS or other persons that might be on the wanted list, which had been compiled during the course of the war. And in 1946, I may have mentioned in early 1946, I was sent to Dachau to handle to support the War Crimes Tribunal, which was going to try the SS men responsible for the execution of American prisoners of war that had surrendered during the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium in December 1944.
So American prisoners of war were executed.
Yes, they had surrendered to the Nazis, to the Germans, and this happened to be a very fanatical outfit called the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler of the SS, and they had been indoctrinated, deeply indoctrinated. And these Americans had surrendered, And the German, the SS, the Waffen-SS, who were passing through, this is during the early days of when the Nazis, when the Wehrmacht was quite successful in their attempt to break through to Antwerp, and they captured several thousand Americans, as a matter of fact. But about 100 and some odd Americans were executed in the very place where they had surrendered by the SS of this organization that I mentioned.
That was on trial.
And they were being tried in Camp Dachau, which ironically was the former concentration camp.
Yes.
And my job really was only a support job. It was simply they were going to be tried by lawyers and prosecutors, and they had defense counsels, of course. But my job was to simply verify their identity, their background, and then to discharge them from the German armed forces and rearrest them as war criminals.
What happened to most of those people who were
Well,
tried there?
The head man, or the man who was responsible, was General Sepp Dietrich. And he was given, he was commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge. And evidently, some of the orders they were not explicitly to execute prisoners. They simply said, don't be held up by prisoners. So that's what they did. They weren't going to be held up. The actual commander of the unit that did this ignominious deed was a Hauptstandartenführer, which was the equivalent of a regimental commander of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, whose name was Joachim Pieper, or Piper. And he was given, I think Dietrich was given an 8-year or 9-year sentence, but was released after 5 years.
Very light sentence.
Very light.
And Pieper?
He was sent, I think he was given a life sentence. But after several years, he either escaped or was released and went to France. And he was murdered then, evidently by somebody who was aware.
Who knew what he had done.
So he had
So
justice prevailed, at least in that one case.
And then your military career continued.
So then I went into, in late '46, I went into the counterintelligence corps of the Army and worked for 2 years in Munich, doing counterintelligence work. Most of it was really against the communist threat, the penetration of the Bavarian government by communists, and the ultimate, by this time, American foreign policy had changed, and of course the Soviets became the the major
Cold War.
enemy, and the Cold War had begun.
And eventually your career took you to Tokyo and...
Well, I went from there, I went and became a German instructor at the intelligence school in Baltimore. From there, I was sent to the counterintelligence unit in San Francisco. From there, I went to the counterintelligence unit in Tokyo, Japan, where I ran the Soviet counter-espionage branch. And just briefly, I was deeply involved in the defection of a Soviet colonel whose name was Rostvorov, who defected to me in January 1954.
Really? And then?
Then I...
and he remained, he was credible and joined the free world after that? General who defected.
He defected. I met him in a snowstorm in Tokyo in January 1954, January the 24th, I believe it was. And we turned him over to the CIA, but I participated in debriefing him in Okinawa.
And then your military career continued.
And my career continued. By the way, I had applied for regular Army while I was stationed in New York. And because I suppose they considered I had a pretty good record, I was accepted, and I became an infantry officer. And by that time I was a major in the Army. I attended the infantry school course, and I attended the parachute course, and and I went to Korea and served 14 months in Korea.
I know altogether your military career was 31 years.
31 years.
What about Vietnam?
I was in Vietnam also.
You were also in Vietnam.
I might say that from Korea, I went to the 82nd Airborne Division when I came back to the United States. From there, I had been working laboriously on getting a college degree, and I was sent by the Army for 9 months to attend the University of Nebraska in Omaha. And I obtained a degree there.
Wonderful.
And then I was sent to the...
What was the degree? What was the degree?
It was Bachelor of General Science, I think they call it, BGS. We were encouraged in those days to finish our education. I'm still working on it. From there I went to the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And I was, from there I went from the 82nd Airborne Division, I went Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and I spent actually 4 years there. I was for 3 years I was on the faculty, and 1 year as a student. I taught tactics while I was there. And by the way, I sponsored the first German Army liaison officer from the new German Army.
Oh.
Who came to Fort Leavenworth. And he was...
That was full circle, wasn't it?
It was full circle.
When did you retire from the army?
Well, from there I went, I had a NATO assignment in Germany, and I commanded an infantry battalion in Germany, and from there I went to Vietnam for a year and came back in 1969. I was director of counterintelligence on the Army staff, and then director of counterintelligence at the Defense Intelligence Agency. And from there I retired as a colonel on 1 September 1974.
50 years old.
What's that?
Exactly, almost your 50th birthday.
I retired two days before my 50th birthday.
And then you,
by
the way, you have no accent. Your English is absolutely free of accent. I'm sure there were awards through this military career, and I heard intelligence all the way through. You were counterintelligence, and then you started a second career.
Well, when I was director of counterintelligence on the Army staff, there was this was in 1969 when I came back from Vietnam. The anti-Vietnam war demonstrations were in full swing, and there were these massive demonstrations in Washington. And part of my responsibility was to monitor those demonstrations.
Oh my.
And then there was the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which was known because the Students for Democratic Society were beaten up by Mayor Daley's police very badly. And Senator Sam Ervin of Arkansas wanted to know why the Army was spying on civilians. And the Army committed itself to conduct an inquiry. And they set up a board of inquiry made up of 2 lawyers and 1 military officer. I was that military officer. So I participated in the inquiry, and we went...
Troubling time.
We went to Chicago for about 6 or 8 weeks and interviewed people to see whether these allegations were true and were valid. And then the Army reported back to Senator Ervin. And I don't want to keep on going into this because as you know, I retired then in 74.
Yes.
And in 73 or 74, there was this church committee, which was headed by Senator Church of Idaho, yes. And it also was looking into allegations. This is after Watergate. into allegations of what the various intelligence agencies had done, whether they had violated the civil rights of Americans. And as a result of the church committee, the cabinet level, every cabinet level organization in the government committed itself to set up an inspector general position to look into these allegations. And the first inspector general in the Department of Defense was from the Watergate staff. And his name was Carl Feldbaum. He had worked, and he later worked for Senator Specter. He had worked with Specter when Specter was the district attorney in Philadelphia. So he had good credentials.
So this whole Inspector General
He became Inspector General for Intelligence.
world then is what you entered
And
after you retired from the Army.
And he was looking for, he was told to set up this office. And I received a call from him asking me to come in and have a chat with him. And he told me that he was interested in organizing this office and would I be interested in becoming the deputy. And I became his deputy.
Feldbaum's deputy.
And 3 years later, he left. And he left, and as a matter of interest, he left with Colin Powell to help set up the Department of Energy, which was just then being organized. This was in 1979. And so I became the acting Inspector General. And 6 months later, I was anointed as the Inspector General.
Inspector General.
And
how long was that?
well, I was, the mission of my office was to assure that the intelligence activities of the Department of Defense were legal and proper and were properly approved by the appropriate authorities. And however, they changed the name of my office. Instead of Inspector General, I became Assistant to the Secretary of Defense in 1982. You know, there are reorganizations.
Yes. That was these were civilian positions.
Yes, I was in what they called the Senior Executive Service.
And this was in the Pentagon?
This was in the Pentagon.
Your office?
Yes.
Assistant to the Secretary of Defense.
Yes. And I worked for a total of, I think, 4 or 5 secretaries. I started out with Secretary Brown. When I arrived there, I think Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense. Then
How well did you know these people? How much contact did you have with the Secretary of Defense?
I usually worked through their executive assistant. And then he would decide whether I should take this issue up with the secretary. And then I would meet with the secretary. And the one that I had the most access to, of all things, was Secretary Cheney. And I arranged briefings for him and escorted people, I mean, senior government officials who wanted to see him on intelligence matters. I would sit in on those meetings.
A full and interesting
And so I
career.
worked for Secretary Brown, Secretary Rumsfeld, Secretary Weinberger, Secretary Carlucci, and Secretary Cheney.
And that was a 17-year career.
17 years, yes.
So altogether,
Altogether, 48
this
years.
life that was
I don't know why I'm
spared
here.
through this good reason. Now, very quickly, your family, you married when?
I
Along
married
the
in
way?
1952
Uh-huh.
a young lady who was working in the same office to which I was assigned.
Mm-hmm. And
Her name is Joanne, Joen, and her maiden name was Sheldon.
and you have children.
I have two daughters, one who lives in Memphis,
And her
Tennessee.
name? Her name?
Her name is Leslie Aldridge.
Mm-hmm.
And she has two daughters also.
Mm-hmm.
We were never able to produce any boys.
And your other
And
daughter?
both of these, while my wife is not Jewish, both of my daughters chose to be Jewish, and both of my granddaughters became bat mitzvah.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Were your daughters then converted formally?
The niece, the one who's here, was converted formally.
Mm-hmm.
Leslie did not convert formally, I don't think.
But raised her daughters.
But she raised
But
her daughters.
Aldridge, is her husband Jewish?
Aldridge? No.
Yes.
No.
Did he also choose the Jewish to follow with?
No, I don't think
curious.
so.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he's
Supportive.
very supportive.
Mm-hmm. Interesting and good to know this. Do you have contact now with other OTC survivors?
Very seldom.
Mm-hmm.
I went to that original, well, I have one with whom I'm very friendly.
He was on the ship with you, or
No,
how do you know
no.
him? Mm-hmm.
He had a similar background as I did. His name is Arnold Weiss,
Mm-hmm.
and he lives in Maryland,
Mm-hmm.
in the suburbs. And he's had a wonderful career, both in government. He was with the Inter-American Bank, and he was a lawyer.
So you met him through the reunion?
I met him in Chicago.
At the reunion?
At the reunion.
When was that?
That was in the year 2000.
2000. And that was what Iris Posner pulled together,
She
right?
did all that, yes.
Mm-hmm. Has there been another reunion?
No.
No. Do you have a newsletter or anything like that?
Well, periodically we receive an email that keeps us informed on any activities. Mm-hmm. It's not only for the 1,000 children, but also for the generation after. You may have heard of that.
Second generation.
Second generation, yes.
What do you tell your children or grandchildren about the Holocaust? You speak here very openly. Have you talked to them throughout their lives? Yes.
Yes.
What happened to your family?
Well, yes, they are interested. And my children, my two daughters particularly, were extremely, they really regretted that they never met their grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
My
Or
father.
grandmother.
Yeah.
Oh,
They met my
grandfather.
they
I'm
met my
thinking
mother.
of
Well,
great
yeah,
grandparents.
that's right.
If you haven't already shared the most vivid memory, could you describe it and explain why it would be your most vivid memory or of that time?
Of course, the most terrible thing, I think, is after the war, when my job was to find Germans who were wanted for war crimes or who were had high positions in the Nazi hierarchy, and I still haven't come to grips with or can comprehend how these people could stand by and say, we didn't know anything about this. There was always a collective denial or a collective delusion that how could this have happened in this wonderful country?
You heard this.
And yet, there were some people who found the civil courage somehow to oppose or to stand up.
Of course there
And I
were
wonder,
those.
in any society, how would I have behaved under those circumstances? What would I have done?
These war criminals in Dachau were on trial for murdering American soldiers. Were they also interrogated about what was done to the Jews?
No.
Concentration
No.
camps? No.
That played no role in that at all.
Not at all.
It was highly structured,
Was focused
just
on.
to that
Yes.
one terrible incident.
But you had encounters, you did, who denied what happened or said
Yes.
they didn't know. Who were those people?
Well,
You were in Germany.
I have,
before.
as a matter of fact, a very close German friend from Munich, and particularly the wife is very active, and the husband had a very high position in the Bavarian government and in the political movement of the Christian Social Union, which is the Catholic party in Bavaria. And they lived in a part of Munich, and she told me that she remembered when the Gestapo came into their apartment building and broke into an apartment and took some people away. And she said, we did nothing. And she said, what could we have done? You know, what could
They too
a single individual do? You know, but this was the general attitude. And I also had an experience where how are we on time?
We have 10 minutes. Yes. I'm interested in your experience. I don't know if my questions will draw it out.
I think your questions are very good.
Yes. Have you been able to separate your feelings for Nazis from your feelings about German people in general?
It's very difficult because I have friends here in the United States, one whom I went to school with, Jewish, we were young Jewish boys together. He refused to ever go back to Germany.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I don't ever want to go back.
Can't do it.
But I felt somewhat differently. And I have to emphasize that I had German officers working for me and German enlisted men working for me when I was assigned to NATO,
Mm-hmm.
to this NATO headquarters in Heidelberg.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very, very decent people.
You saw the decent people.
Yes.
Who were also.
But of course, the Holocaust was I wouldn't say it wasn't perpetrated by decent people, but the worst thing you can have is decent people doing nothing.
Decent people who were totally misled.
That's right. That's right.
And
they were caught up in the...
What one lesson do you think we should learn from remembering the Holocaust? Are we getting to it with this discussion?
I think that the most important thing is when you have an authoritarian system is that civil courage, that there be people who speak out. And as I said, as a mortal myself, what would I have done in similar circumstances? For instance, when all my friends were joining the Jungvolk,
Mm-hmm.
I was so young, I was 9 years old, or going on 10, and I was wondering, I'd ask my father, why can't we join that too?
Mm-hmm.
And he'd say, because we're Jews, we can't join that.
Mm-hmm. So it's important to speak out.
It is so important.
When it's still possible.
When it is still possible. And of course, I'm influenced by my military experience too.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't deny that. And that is that I ran into situations when I was Inspector General, when word got to me where some army commander or somebody said, if I catch the next one complaining to Mr. Michel when he comes around, he's going to be in real trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And my modus operandi was to go down and talk to the lowest level operational people who would tell me the truth, not who would tell me what I wanted to hear,
mm-hmm.
but what I should hear.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked several cases.
So what you're saying is listen to the grassroots.
Exactly.
Not the politicians.
That's where if you want to find what's really going on.
What's going on.
Yes.
Yes. Do you see any dangers in America today? And that's my last question.
Of course, we live in the rarefied air of a free society.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the probability, There's always a possibility, but the probability of a authoritarian regime ever running our nation is extremely remote.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have, and this is the point that I tried to do when I was Inspector General, was to institutionalize compliance with lawful policies. And we have these institutions in this country that protect us from ourselves, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very important.
The balance.
Yeah.
Mr. Michel, thank you so very, very much for this interview and for sharing all this, your life, your most interesting life with us.
Mm-hmm. My pleasure. Not my pleasure, but my privilege,
Your
to be here.
Yes. And as a Virginian, we're very proud to have you.
Thank you so much.